The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the concrete training facility at Fort Braxton, where the air hung thick with anticipation and a metallic scent of sweat. Sergeant First Class Derek Morrison stood like a monument of intimidation in the center of the Spartan gymnasium, his massive 6'4" frame draped and perfectly pressed. Fatigues that couldn't quite conceal the network of scars crisscrossing his forearms, souvenirs from 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless bar fights that had cemented his reputation as the most feared instructor on. Spaced out 23 candidates stood at rigid attention in a perfect formation, their faces masks of controlled anxiety. They had all heard the whispered stories in the barracks about Morrison's demonstrations, how he had hospitalized a Navy SEAL candidate last month, how he'd made a Green Beret prospect quit the program in tears, how his training methods walked the razor's edge between instruction and assault. But today felt different. Today, the electricity in the air seemed to crackle with a particular malevolence. Maya Rodriguez stood in the back row, her 5'6" frame dwarfed by the towering men surrounding her. But her posture radiated an unmistakable confidence that seemed to irritate Morrison like a splinter under his skin. She was the first woman to make it this far in the elite Ranger selection program in over 2 years. And every day she remained was a personal affront to Morrison's deeply held beliefs about women in combat roles. "Listen up, maggots." Morrison's voice boomed across the facility like thunder, causing several candidates to flinch involuntarily. His pale blue eyes, cold as winter ice, swept across the formation with predatory intensity. Today we're going to discuss the harsh realities of close-quarters combat. The kind of brutal, unforgiving violence that separates the warriors from the weekend warriors. He began his prowl, each footstep deliberate and menacing as he circled the formation like a shark sensing blood in the water. His massive hands, scarred and calloused from decades of violence, flexed and unflexed rhythmically. The candidates could hear their own heartbeats in the oppressive silence that followed his words. "In real combat, there are no rules," Morrison continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than his earlier shouts. "No referees, no timeouts, no mercy for the weak." His eyes found Maya again, lingering on her with obvious disdain. "The enemy doesn't care about your feelings, your background, or your gender. They care about one thing: killing you before you kill them." Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her military bearing with the discipline of someone who had faced this kind of intimidation before. Her dark eyes remained fixed, straight ahead, refusing to give Morrison the satisfaction of a reaction. She had grown up in East Los Angeles, where showing weakness meant becoming prey, and she had learned early that bullies fed on fear like vampires fed on blood. Morrison stopped directly in front of her, so close she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the network of broken capillaries across his nose, evidence of too many nights drowning his demons in alcohol. "Rodriguez," he said, her name dripping from his lips like poison. "Step forward." The command hung in the air like a death sentence. Maya stepped forward with crisp precision, her boots clicking against the concrete in perfect rhythm. The other candidates remained frozen, their eyes carefully averted, each silently grateful they weren't in her position. "Tell me, Rodriguez," Morrison said, beginning to circle her like a predator toying with wounded prey. "What makes you think you belong here? What makes you think you can handle what real soldiers face in the field?" Maya's voice was steady and clear when she responded. "I'm here because I earned my place, Sergeant. Same as everyone else." A cool smile spread across Morrison's weathered face, revealing teeth stained yellow from years of cigarettes and chewing tobacco. "Earned your place?" He let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the concrete walls. "You think passing some physical fitness tests and shooting targets at a range prepares you for real combat?" He stopped directly in front of her again, his massive frame casting her in shadow. Let me tell you something about real combat, princess. It's not about your test scores or your pretty little certificates. It's about raw, brutal violence. It's about being willing to do whatever it takes to survive when someone is trying to tear your throat out with their bare hands. The tension in the room was becoming suffocating. Several candidates shifted nervously, their training warring with their instinct to intervene. But they all knew that stepping out of line would mean immediate dismissal from the program, and possibly a personal demonstration of Morrison's teaching methods. Morrison's voice rose again, filling the cavernous space with its menacing resonance. Combat is chaos. It's blood and screaming and the smell of death. It's watching your buddies die while you fight for every breath. His eyes never left Maya's face, searching for any crack in her composure. And when that moment comes, when you're face to face with an enemy who wants nothing more than to watch the life drain from your eyes, all your political correctness and equal opportunity bullshit won't save you. Maya's hands remained perfectly still at her sides, but those who looked closely could see the slight tension in her shoulders. The way her breathing had become more controlled and deliberate. She was a coiled spring, storing energy for a moment that might never come. I think it's time for a practical demonstration, Morrison announced, his voice taking on an almost gleeful quality that sent chills down the spines of everyone present. Time to show you all what real combat looks like. He gestured broadly to the blue training mats that covered a section of the concrete floor. Rodriguez, you're going to help me demonstrate proper defensive techniques against a larger, stronger opponent. The way he said, it made it clear this would be anything but a standard training exercise. The other candidates began to form a loose circle around the mats, their faces pale with anticipation and dread. They had all heard about Morrison's demonstrations, brutal affairs, that were more about humiliation and intimidation than actual instruction. Several candidates exchanged worried glances, but none dared speak up. In the military hierarchy, Morrison was untouchable, protected by his rank and his reputation as a war hero. Maya walked to the center of the mats with measured steps, her mind already calculating angles and distances, assessing threats and opportunities. She had trained in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu since she was 12, earning her black belt before enlisting, but she kept that information to herself. In her experience, it was better to be underestimated than to paint a target on your back. Morrison followed her onto the mats, cracking his knuckles with deliberate menace. The sound echoed through the gymnasium like breaking bones. "Now, class," he said, his voice carrying the mock professorial tone of someone about to deliver a particularly cruel lesson. "Pay close attention. What you're about to see is what happens when political correctness meets battlefield reality." The circle of candidates tightened around them, their faces a mixture of fascination and horror. They were about to witness either a masterclass in combat instruction or a career-ending assault, and none of them were quite sure which it would be. Morrison rolled his massive shoulders, the muscles rippling beneath his uniform like coiled steel cables. His smile had taken on a predatory quality that made several candidates take an unconscious step backward. The stage was set, the players in position, and the powder keg was about to explode. The gymnasium fell into an unnatural silence, the kind of oppressive quiet that precedes violence. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hum with nervous energy as Morrison and Maya faced each other on the blue training mats. The circle of candidates had unconsciously tightened, drawn by the same morbid fascination that makes people slow down to stare at car accidents. Morrison began to circle, Maya with the calculated movements of a seasoned predator, his boots making soft squeaking sounds against the vinyl surface of the mats. His pale eyes never left her face, studying her like a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. "The first thing you need to understand about real combat," he said, his voice carrying the false calm of a professor delivering a lecture, is that it's not fair. It's not sporting. It's not civilized. Maya maintained her fighting stance, her feet shoulder-width apart, her center of gravity low and balanced. Her dark eyes tracked Morrison's movement with the focused intensity of someone who understood that her career and possibly her physical well-being hung in the balance. She had faced bullies before, but never one with this much institutional protection and this much to prove. In Afghanistan, Morrison continued, his voice taking on a nostalgic quality that somehow made it even more menacing. I watched a Taliban fighter take down 3 Marines with nothing but a rusty knife and pure animal aggression. Size didn't matter. Training didn't matter. What mattered was the willingness to do whatever it took to win. He stopped circling and faced her directly, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the mats. The candidates around them held their collective breath, sensing that the moment of truth was approaching like a gathering storm. "Rodriguez," Morrison said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "I want you to attack me. Show these gentlemen what you've got. Show them why you think you deserve to be here." Maya's eyes narrowed slightly. She recognized the trap immediately. If she attacked with full force, she would be accused of assaulting a superior officer. If she held back, Morrison would use her restraint as evidence of her weakness. It was a no-win scenario, carefully constructed to humiliate her regardless of her response. "I'm waiting for instructions, Sergeant," Maya replied, her voice steady and professional. "What specific technique would you like me to demonstrate?" Morrison's cruel smile widened. "Oh, I think you misunderstood me, Rodriguez. This isn't a demonstration. This is an assessment. I want to see what you do when someone is actually trying to hurt you." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Several candidates shifted uncomfortably, their training warring with their moral instincts. They all knew they were about to witness something that crossed the line from instruction into abuse. But the military hierarchy was absolute. Morrison was untouchable. "Come on, princess," Morrison taunted, his voice rising to fill the cavernous space. "Show me that killer instinct. Show me you're not just another diversity hire taking up space that belongs to a real warrior." Maya's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. She had learned long ago that bullies fed on emotional reactions like sharks fed on blood. The key was to remain calm, to think tactically, to wait for the right moment. Morrison's patience finally snapped. "Fine," he snarled, his mask of false civility falling away completely. "If you won't attack, then I'll show you what real aggression looks like." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of a natural disaster. Morrison exploded into motion with shocking speed for such a large man, his years of combat experience evident in every movement. He feinted left, then drove forward with his right shoulder, using his superior size and weight like a battering ram. Maya tried to sidestep the attack, her reflexes honed by years of martial arts training. But Morrison had anticipated her movement. His massive arm swept out like a club, catching her across the chest and driving the air from her lungs in a sharp gasp that echoed through the gymnasium. The impact sent Maya stumbling backward, her feet tangling as she fought to maintain her balance. Morrison pressed his advantage ruthlessly, his hands shooting out to grab her uniform jacket. His fingers closed around the fabric like steel clamps, and with a grunt of effort, he lifted her completely off the ground. For a moment, Maya hung suspended in the air, her feet kicking uselessly as Morrison held her aloft like a trophy. The candidates around them watched in stunned silence, their faces pale with shock and disbelief. This had gone far beyond any reasonable training exercise. "This is what happens," Morrison bellowed, his voice filled with savage satisfaction, "when political correctness meets battlefield reality." With that declaration, he drove Maya downward with all the force his powerful frame could generate. She hit the training mat with a sickening thud that seemed to shake the entire building. The impact was so violent that several candidates actually flinched, their bodies reacting instinctively to the sound of human suffering. Maya lay motionless on the blue vinyl surface, her face pressed against the mat, her dark hair splayed around her head like spilled ink. A thin trickle of blood began to seep from her split lip, forming a small crimson pool on the training surface. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow and labored. Morrison stood over her fallen form like a conquering gladiator, his chest heaving with exertion and adrenaline. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the gymnasium, and his hands trembled slightly with the aftershock of violence. "This," he announced to the circle of horrified candidates, "is why women don't belong in combat roles." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to have stopped their incessant humming, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Several candidates looked away, unable to watch Maya's motionless form, while others stared in fascination at the brutal display of power. Morrison began to pace around Maya's body, his boots clicking against the mat with each step. "In real combat," he continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor delivering a lecture over a cadaver, "there are no participation trophies. There are no second chances. There are only winners and losers, predators and prey." He gestured dismissively at Maya's still form. "This is what happens when social engineering meets biological reality, when political correctness encounters the harsh truths of warfare." His voice rose with evangelical fervor. "The enemy doesn't care about your gender equality policies. They don't care about your diversity initiatives. They care about one thing: killing you before you kill them." Maya remained motionless, her face a mask of apparent defeat. Blood continued to trickle from her lip, and her breathing was so shallow that several candidates began to wonder if Morrison had seriously injured her. The demonstration had crossed every line of acceptable conduct, but Morrison's rank and reputation made him untouchable. "Look at her," Morrison commanded, his voice filled with contempt. "This is your future if you let weakness into your ranks. This is what happens when you prioritize feelings over fighting ability." He turned his back on Maya's prone form, facing the circle of candidates with the satisfied expression of someone who had just proven an important point. His massive frame blocked their view of Maya as he launched into his victory speech, his voice echoing off the concrete walls with renewed confidence. "Real warriors understand that combat is about dominance," he declared, his arms spread wide in a gesture of triumph. "It's about imposing your will on the enemy through superior violence and aggression." But as Morrison continued his monologue, none of the candidates noticed the subtle change in Maya's breathing, or the way her fingers had begun to curl slowly into fists against the training mat. The gymnasium remained trapped in Morrison's spell of dominance as he continued his victory lecture, his back turned to Maya's seemingly broken form. His voice boomed with renewed confidence, each word dripping with the satisfaction of someone who believed he had just proven an unshakable truth about the natural order of things. "This is why our enemies don't take us seriously anymore," Morrison declared, gesturing broadly to the circle of pale-faced candidates. "This is why we're losing wars to farmers with AK-47s and improvised explosives. We've gone soft. We've let political correctness poison our warrior culture." But while Morrison basked in his moment of triumph, something extraordinary was happening behind him. Maya's eyes, which had been closed in apparent defeat, suddenly snapped open with laser-sharp focus. There was no confusion, no disorientation, only the cold, calculating gaze of a predator who had been playing possum. Her breathing, which had appeared labored and weak, shifted into the controlled rhythm of someone preparing for explosive action. The blood on her lip had already begun to coagulate, and what the candidates had mistaken for serious injury was nothing more than a superficial cut. Maya had taken harder hits during her years of competitive martial arts training. The modern military has forgotten what it means to be warriors. Morrison continued, his voice rising with evangelical fervor. We've traded strength for sensitivity, aggression for accommodation. Maya's movement was so sudden, so perfectly executed, that several candidates would later swear they never actually saw it happen. One moment she was lying motionless on the mat, apparently defeated and humiliated. The next, she was flowing across the training surface like liquid lightning, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of combat. Her legs swept out in a perfect arc, catching Morrison's ankles with surgical precision, just as he shifted his weight to emphasize a particularly important point in his speech. The technique was flawless, a basic foot sweep that she had practiced thousands of times, but executed with the timing and leverage that separated masters from amateurs. Morrison's eyes widened in shock as his feet were suddenly yanked out from under him. His massive frame, which had seemed so imposing and unshakable moments before, became a liability as gravity took hold. He crashed to the training mat with a thunderous impact that seemed to shake the entire building, his skull bouncing off the vinyl surface with a hollow crack that made several candidates wince in sympathetic pain. But Maya wasn't finished. As Morrison hit the ground, she was already moving, her body flowing seamlessly from the sweep into her next attack. She rolled across his fallen form with the grace of a dancer and the precision of a surgeon, her movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Before Morrison could even process what had happened, Maya had secured a perfect armbar, one of the most devastating submission holds in martial arts. Her legs wrapped around his extended arm like steel cables, her hips positioned perfectly to apply maximum leverage to his elbow joint. It was a technique that could snap bone with minimal effort, and Morrison found himself completely helpless in its grip. The transformation was so complete, so sudden, that the watching candidates stood frozen in disbelief. The woman who had appeared broken and defeated seconds earlier now controlled the situation with absolute authority. Morrison, the feared instructor who had terrorized countless soldiers, was trapped as helplessly as a child. "What the?" Morrison began, his voice cracking with shock and the first hints of panic. He tried to muscle his way out of the hold, his free hand clawing at Maya's legs, but she had positioned herself perfectly. Every movement he made only tightened her control, only increased the pressure on his vulnerable joint. Maya's voice, when she spoke, was calm and controlled, carrying none of the emotion that Morrison had been trying to provoke. "Sergeant," she said, her tone almost conversational, "I need you to stop struggling. This hold can cause permanent damage if you don't cooperate." The irony was not lost on anyone present. The woman Morrison had just brutalized was now showing him more consideration than he had shown her. But there was steel beneath her courtesy, a quiet authority that made it clear she was completely in control of the situation. Morrison's face had turned an alarming shade of red, whether from embarrassment, anger, or the blood rushing to his head in his awkward position. "Let me go. You little." Maya applied just enough pressure to cut off his words, the threat of serious injury suddenly very real. Morrison's eyes widened as he felt his elbow joint strain against forces it was never designed to withstand. "I said stop struggling, Sergeant. I'm trying to help you here." The candidates around them had begun to murmur among themselves, their voices a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had just witnessed the impossible, the feared Morrison. The man who had ended careers and broken spirits had been completely dominated by the woman he had just humiliated. "How did she?" one candidate whispered. "Did you see how fast?" Another began. "She was playing dead the whole time," a third observed, his voice filled with grudging admiration. Morrison continued to struggle, his pride warring with the very real threat of serious injury. His free hand slapped uselessly at the mat, his legs kicking like an overturned turtle. The mighty predator had become helpless prey in a matter of seconds. "This is impossible," Morrison gasped, his voice strained with effort and disbelief. "You were down. You were finished." Maya's grip remained steady, her positioning perfect. "I was assessing the situation, Sergeant. Sometimes the best defense is to let your opponent think they've already won." The wisdom in her words was not lost on the watching candidates. They were witnessing a masterclass in tactical thinking, in the kind of strategic patience that separated true warriors from mere bullies. Morrison had been so focused on his moment of triumph that he had forgotten the most basic rule of combat. Never turn your back on an opponent until you're certain they're truly defeated. "You see," Maya continued, her voice taking on an almost instructional tone, "real combat isn't just about size and aggression. It's about timing, technique, and the ability to think under pressure. It's about using your opponent's assumptions against them." Morrison's struggles were becoming weaker, his body beginning to recognize the futility of his situation. The armbar was locked in perfectly, and Maya's positioning made escape virtually impossible without risking serious injury. "The enemy you described, Sergeant, the one who doesn't care about rules of fairness, that enemy also doesn't care about your preconceptions. They'll use every advantage they can find, including your own arrogance." The lesson was clear, and it was being delivered with the kind of practical demonstration that no classroom instruction could match. The candidates watched in fascination as their understanding of combat, of strategy, of what it meant to be a warrior, was fundamentally altered. Morrison's face had progressed from red to purple, his breathing becoming labored as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his shock. He was completely at Maya's mercy, and they both knew it. "Tap out, Sergeant," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying just enough authority to make it clear this was not a request. "Before this goes any further." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything Morrison believed about strength, about dominance, about the natural order of things. His entire worldview was crumbling around him, and everyone in the gymnasium could see it happening in real time. The moment stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Morrison's purple face contorted with a mixture of pain, rage, and the dawning realization that his entire worldview was crumbling beneath him. His free hand trembled as it hovered inches above the training mat, pride warring with the very real threat of permanent injury. The armbar was locked in with surgical precision, and Maya's positioning made escape impossible without risking a shattered elbow. "Tap," Maya repeated, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone completely in control. "Don't let your ego cost you your career, Sergeant." The irony of her words was not lost on anyone present. Here was the woman Morrison had just brutalized, showing him more mercy than he had ever shown any of his victims. But beneath her professional courtesy lay an unmistakable steel she would break his arm, if necessary to make her point. Morrison's hand slapped the mat 3 times in rapid succession, the sound echoing through the gymnasium like gunshots. The moment his palm hit the vinyl surface, Maya immediately released the hold, rolling away from him with the same fluid grace she had displayed throughout the encounter. She rose to her feet in one smooth motion, her uniform barely wrinkled despite the violence she had just endured and delivered. Blood still traced a thin line from her split lip, but her posture radiated calm confidence. She extended her hand toward Morrison, who was struggling to sit up while cradling his throbbing arm. "Need help, Sergeant?" Maya asked, her tone genuinely respectful despite everything that had just transpired. Morrison stared at her outstretched hand for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The woman he had dismissed as a diversity hire had just systematically dismantled him in front of his own students. His reputation, carefully built over decades of intimidation and brutality, lay in ruins at his feet. "I don't need your help," Morrison snarled, but his voice lacked its earlier venom. He struggled to his feet unassisted, his movements awkward and pained. His face had returned to its normal color, but the humiliation burned in his eyes like hot coals. Maya lowered her hand without offense, maintaining her professional bearing. "Understood, Sergeant." She turned to face the circle of candidates, who was staring at her with expressions ranging from awe to disbelief to barely concealed admiration. "What you just witnessed," Maya said, her voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, "demonstrates several important tactical principles." Her tone was calm and instructional, as if she were delivering a planned lesson rather than improvising in the aftermath of a brutal confrontation. Morrison opened his mouth to reassert his authority, but Maya continued speaking, her words cutting through his attempted interruption with surgical precision. "First, never assume your opponent is defeated until you've confirmed it beyond doubt. In real combat, playing dead or injured can be a viable tactical option." Her eyes swept across the watching candidates, making sure each one understood the lesson. "Second, size and aggression are only advantages if you know how to use them properly. Technique and timing can overcome raw strength." Several candidates nodded unconsciously, their minds racing to process the implications of what they had just seen. The woman they had watched get brutalized was now delivering a masterclass in combat strategy, her authority unquestionable despite her lower rank. "Third," Maya continued, "underestimating your enemy based on preconceptions, whether about gender, size, or apparent weakness, is a tactical error that can cost you everything." Her gaze found Morrison, who was standing at the edge of the circle like a wounded animal. "In real combat, that kind of mistake gets people killed." Morrison's face flushed red again, but this time it was pure embarrassment rather than exertion. "That's enough," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Class dismissed. But the candidates didn't move. They remained frozen in place, their attention focused entirely on Maya. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely that Morrison's authority seemed to have evaporated like morning mist. Maya nodded respectfully toward Morrison. "Thank you for the demonstration, Sergeant. It was very educational." The words were perfectly professional, but everyone present could hear the subtle irony beneath them. She began to walk toward the exit, her movements calm and unhurried. But as she passed through the circle of candidates, something remarkable happened. One by one, they began to step aside, creating a clear path for her passage. It wasn't the fearful deference they had shown Morrison. It was genuine respect. "Rodriguez," called out candidate Thompson, a former college football player who stood 6'3" and weighed 240 pounds. "That was incredible. Where did you learn to fight like that?" Maya paused, turning back to face the group. "Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu since I was 12. My instructor always said that technique beats strength, but I never had to prove it quite so dramatically before." A ripple of nervous laughter ran through the candidates. The tension that had gripped the room was finally beginning to dissipate, replaced by a mixture of admiration and relief. "Why didn't you mention your martial arts background during intake?" asked candidate Williams, a former Marine who had been skeptical of Maya's presence in the program. Maya's expression grew serious. "Because I wanted to be judged on my military performance, not my civilian accomplishments. I wanted to prove I belonged here on the same terms as everyone else." Morrison, who had been standing silently at the edge of the group, finally found his voice. "This training session is over," he announced, but his words carried none of their earlier authority. "Everyone return to your barracks." The candidates began to file out of the gymnasium, but their conversations were animated and excited. They had just witnessed something that would become legend in the barracks. The day the untouchable Morrison was brought low by the woman he had tried to humiliate. As the crowd thinned, several candidates approached Maya directly. Thompson clapped her on the shoulder with obvious respect. "That was the most badass thing I've ever seen," he said with genuine admiration. Williams, the former Marine, extended his hand for a shake. "I owe you an apology, Rodriguez. I had my doubts about women in combat roles, but you just changed my mind completely." Maya accepted the handshake with grace. "We all have preconceptions, Williams. The key is being willing to change them when presented with new evidence." More candidates approached, each offering their own words of respect and admiration. Maya accepted their praise with quiet dignity, never gloating or showing any sign of arrogance, despite her stunning victory. As the last of the candidates filed out, Maya found herself alone in the gymnasium with Morrison. He stood near the equipment storage area, his shoulders slumped in defeat. For a moment, she considered simply leaving, but something in his posture made her pause. "Sergeant," she said quietly, "for what it's worth, you're right about one thing. Combat is brutal and unforgiving. But that's exactly why we need every capable warrior we can get, regardless of what they look like." Morrison looked up at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and perhaps the first glimmer of grudging respect. "You could have broken my arm," he said quietly. Maya nodded. "Yes, I could have. But we're on the same side, Sergeant. We both want to create the best soldiers possible. We just disagree on what that looks like." She turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Morrison alone with his thoughts and his shattered assumptions. As she reached the doorway, she paused and looked back one final time. "The offer to help still stands, Sergeant, if you ever want to learn some of those techniques." With that, she disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind a gymnasium that would never quite be the same, and a man whose understanding of strength had been forever changed.